2 weeks before any of this happened, my husband and I stood at our baby shower and announced our son's name would be James Patrick. James after my grandfather, Patrick after my husband's brother who died overseas. My sister-in-law Sandra's face changed instantly. She pulled me aside, pressing me over and over. How did I know that name? Where had I heard it? I explained the meaning, showed her photos of the men we were honoring. She kept asking the same question like she hadn't heard me at all, then left without touching her cake. That night she blocked us on everything. We assumed she was dealing with something personal. 2 weeks later at 5 a.m., officers pounded on our door with weapons drawn. Sandra had reported us to a Crimes Against Children unit, claiming we were trafficking our unborn baby under a stolen identity and that she had proof of a planned sale. They separated us instantly. My husband was dragged out in handcuffs while I screamed. I ended up at the hospital, 8 months pregnant, handcuffed to the bed like I'd already been convicted. An officer named Mills sat across from me, gun visible, insisting they knew everything. Facebook marketplace posts he claimed were coded trafficking listings. A 6-year-old child in another state he insisted I was somehow connected to. When my blood pressure monitor started alarming from the stress, he told the nurse I was faking. Another officer arrived saying my baby would be removed at birth, that I'd never see him again if I was lucky enough to avoid life without parole. He claimed my husband had already confessed and blamed everything on me. A lie, though I didn't know it yet. Then the pain started. Sharp stabbing. I told them something was wrong. Mills said it was convenient timing. Then I felt warm liquid and told them I was bleeding. He told me to sit still or he'd add resisting arrest to the charges. A nurse checked anyway and gasped I was hemorrhaging, a placental abruption, life-threatening for both me and the baby. Mills blocked the door, insisting I stay in custody. The doctor who ran in went pale at the blood loss and begged them to let him operate immediately. Mills wanted to call his supervisor first. The call went to voicemail. He started leaving a message while I lost consciousness in stages, blood pooling on the sheet, my pressure crashing, nurses shouting for authorization that still hadn't come. A head nurse pulled hospital policy on a tablet showing custody transferred to medical authority during emergencies. Mills said it looked fake, possibly edited. It was a state document. They finally wheeled me toward the OR with an officer jogging alongside, still convinced I might somehow run while hemorrhaging and unconscious. In the pre-op room, the anesthesiologist refused to operate with me still in handcuffs. Mills insisted I was a flight risk. The anesthesiologist, incredulous, pointed out I was about to be unconscious and bleeding out. Where exactly would I go? He called hospital administration, who arrived, took one look at me, and told the officers they could either wait outside or be reported for attempted murder by denial of care. Mills, undeterred, told me that when I woke up, if I woke up, I'd be charged with everything, and the baby would go straight to Child Protective Services with no contact. I woke up in recovery, barely able to speak. The one word I managed was baby. A nurse told me he was alive. In the NICU, very small, but I couldn't see him. Custody had already been transferred to CPS with a no-contact order in place. That same nurse quietly told me she documented everything Mills had done, the 20-minute delay, while I was actively bleeding out, and slipped me her number in case I ever needed someone to testify. A CPS worker showed up shortly after with paperwork she insisted was routine. Growing hostile the moment I said I wouldn't sign anything without a lawyer. My husband, released on bail his brother had posted, arrived with a swollen eye and a wrist in a brace, insisting through tears he'd never confessed to anything, that officers had beaten him in interrogation until he stopped fighting them. Minutes into our reunion, another officer arrived to enforce a no-contact order that, it turned out, covered contact between the two of us as well, not just with the baby. He was escorted out immediately. A hospital social worker connected me with legal aid. My new lawyer filed an emergency motion for NICU visitation. Discharged days later, still barely able to walk. I came home to a nursery I couldn't bring myself to enter. The crib, the little clothes, the rocking chair all exactly as we'd left them. I closed the door and didn't open it again for months. My milk came in with no baby to feed. I stood in the shower expressing it uselessly down the drain, sobbing until I threw up. At an emergency video hearing days later, the judge granted 1 hour of supervised NICU visits daily, while the no-contact order between me and my husband remained. Getting to the hospital meant 3 buses, since I still couldn't drive. At the NICU, a CPS worker and a security guard searched my bag and stood over every second of the visit, taking notes on how I held him. James was barely 4 pounds, wired and tubed, translucent skin, working hard to breathe. The moment I held him, though, he went quiet. A nurse later whispered he'd been crying nonstop since birth and hadn't settled for anyone else, and made sure to note it in his chart before the CPS worker returned. That same day, my mother-in-law called in tears with an explanation that finally made sense of everything. 4 years earlier, Sandra had miscarried at 5 months and had already chosen the name James Patrick for that baby, decorating a nursery she never used. She never processed the law. Hearing us choose the same name had apparently detonated something in her, twisting grief into a delusion that we'd somehow stolen her dead child's identity to sell him. Our lawyer filed to have the case dismissed based on Sandra's documented mental health history. The prosecutor refused, insisting they had to investigate regardless. Then the bills started, $18,000 for the emergency surgery, $12,000 more for the NICU, with insurance refusing to cover any of it while criminal charges were pending. My husband, unable to work, brought in nothing. Meanwhile, Mills was placed on desk duty pending review, while the other officer involved got promoted to sergeant. The nurse who documented everything had her hours quietly slashed. A week later, a letter arrived. Sandra, through a lawyer, wanted grandparent visitation rights, still convinced James was somehow connected to the baby she'd lost. During one visit, James's monitor alarmed. He'd stopped breathing and was turning blue. The CPS worker froze completely. I performed infant CPR from what I remembered of prenatal classes until he coughed back to life. The same worker then wrote in her report that I'd been aggressive and had failed to follow supervision protocol, cutting my visits to 30 minutes under 2 supervisors instead of 1. My husband, borrowing a coworker's phone, arranged a brief, technically forbidden meeting in a parking lot. A neighbor photographed us through the car window and called the police. He drove off before they arrived. 2 days later, our lawyer discovered Officer Mills had 6 previous complaints for excessive force and false arrest, all quietly buried without discipline. Then Sandra showed up at the hospital screaming that I'd stolen her baby, pushing past nurses toward the locked NICU doors, while security dragged her away in front of terrified family. The stress tanked my milk supply entirely, and the same CPS worker documented that too, as further proof of inadequate care. 3 weeks after his traumatic birth, James developed a heart murmur requiring emergency surgery, a defect the cardiologist attributed to the stress of his delayed delivery. Because CPS held legal custody, I had to watch a social worker I'd never met sign the surgical consent form. His heart stopped twice on the table before he was stabilized. I collapsed in the waiting room and was admitted myself for dehydration and exhaustion. While I was still admitted, hospital security caught Sandra in the parking garage wearing stolen scrubs, trying to sneak into the NICU through an employee entry. She was arrested for trespassing. Prosecutors declined to press charges, citing her need for psychiatric treatment rather than jail. Around the same time, our lawyer discovered, through discovery, that the original police report had been digitally altered 3 days after my surgery, with fabricated details about code words and trafficking connections added after the fact. The metadata proved Mills had falsified it himself. The prosecutor then offered a deal: plead guilty to misdemeanor child endangerment, take 2 years probation, and regain custody in 6 months. Our lawyer called it extortion. I refused. My husband, exhausted and desperate to end it, wanted to take the deal, and we had our first real fight of the entire ordeal over the phone, since we still couldn't see each other in person. A reporter's tip turned our story into a front-page headline calling us accused baby traffickers, and the fallout was immediate and vicious. Our address posted online, our phones flooded with threats, red paint reading "baby killers" sprayed across our garage door overnight, while police shrugged and said there was nothing they could do without footage. At a hearing on James's medical condition, a NICU doctor testified that the 43-minute delay Mills caused while arguing about custody directly caused James's oxygen deprivation and the 2 cardiac arrests during surgery, that a timely delivery would have meant a healthy birth. Days later, Mills abruptly retired with full pension, closing the internal investigation into his conduct automatically, since departments don't investigate former employees. CPS then handed us a mountain of reunification requirements: 12 weeks of parenting classes 40 miles away, random drug testing, $800 psychological evaluations with no insurance coverage, monthly home inspection. We had roughly $300 to our name. I sold my grandmother's wedding ring, her pearl necklace, and an heirloom brooch to cover the evaluations. My own psychologist's report found me severely traumatized, but posing no danger to my child. CPS twisted that same finding to argue I was too unstable to parent. My husband's evaluation went worse. His breakdown while describing James was logged as emotional instability. His employer, citing a morality clause over unproven charges, fired him within days of the news article running. No severance, no unemployment eligibility. 2 months later, James left the NICU, not for home, but for a foster family 20 miles away. Supervised visits were capped at 2 one-hour sessions weekly in a government building under camera surveillance. By our first visit, James, 3 weeks into foster care, no longer recognized us and screamed to be handed back to the caseworker, who documented it as a failure to bond rather than an infant's normal reaction to strangers. Sandra's own family staged an intervention. She locked herself in her room and called the police on them instead. Her husband eventually filed for divorce and emergency custody of their other children after she accused him of being part of our trafficking ring. Meanwhile, our lawyer uncovered a financial motive tangled through the whole case. The foster care agency holding James's placement had multi-million-dollar county contracts, its board members major donors to the prosecutor's campaign, his brother-in-law a paid consultant for the same agency. A conflict of interest motion was filed and largely dismissed as frivolous, though an independent reviewer did later find 17 separate procedural violations, including Mills's falsified report, deemed, incredibly, not severe enough to halt prosecution. The compounding trauma broke me down physically and mentally. I stopped sleeping, lost 20 pounds, began losing time and forgetting where I was. My husband found me at 3 a.m. rocking an empty blanket in the nursery and drove me straight to the ER, where I was admitted and diagnosed with postpartum psychosis brought on by forced separation and surgical trauma. CPS seized on the diagnosis immediately, filing to terminate our parental rights entirely. At the hearing, my psychiatrist testified for 2 hours that the psychosis was a direct, treatable consequence of the separation itself, that reunification would allow full recovery. CPS's own expert, who never examined me, testified that anyone with psychosis was inherently dangerous regardless of cause. During the month-long wait for a ruling, something shifted. Supervised visits were unexpectedly upgraded to unsupervised, 4-hour home visits twice weekly. James, nearly 4 months old, didn't know us at first, screaming when the caseworker left. Slowly, over repeated visits, he began recognizing my voice, calming to songs I'd sung throughout pregnancy. We documented every smile, every reach for our faces, installing cameras throughout the house to prove our fitness as parents. Then Sandra violated her restraining order, mailing 3 increasingly disturbing letters, one claiming she'd forgiven us for stealing her dead baby's soul, another insisting James was her miscarried son reincarnated and trapped in the wrong body, a third covered in scripture, and our names written in red marker. Her husband delivered them himself, apologizing, describing a shrine she'd built to her lost pregnancy using our son's stolen photo. Our lawyer added the letters as further evidence of the accuser's instability and filed again to dismiss. The prosecutor, sensing the case crumbling, offered to drop everything if we agreed never to sue any agency involved. We refused and filed a $10 million federal civil rights lawsuit instead, against the department, Mills personally, CPS, and several caseworkers. The city moved to dismiss on governmental immunity grounds. Our lawyer was ready with case law showing immunity doesn't cover knowing constitutional violations. The turning point came when Sarah, the NICU nurse fired weeks after James's birth for insubordination, contacted our lawyer with an audio recording she'd secretly made the day Mills delayed my surgery, his own voice, admitting to another officer that he knew the trafficking claims were baseless, but they had to follow through since they'd already made the arrest, laughing about how we'd never see our baby grow up. Played for the prosecutor directly, it visibly wrecked him. Within hours, state investigators had opened a case, and federal agents arrested Mills at his desk that same afternoon. The other officer, seeing this, immediately gave a sworn statement admitting Mills had pressured him into the false arrest and had personally falsified the police report afterward. The prosecutor dropped every charge against us that day, with prejudice, permanently barring any future charges tied to the case. The judge ordered CPS to return James immediately. When the agency tried to claim they needed 30 more days of paperwork, the judge threatened contempt charges against agency leadership and demanded James be home by 8 p.m. that night. The foster mother brought him to us that evening in tears, admitting she'd grown to love him, but always knew he belonged with us. James, 5 months old by then, turned his face away from my kiss and reached back for her as she left strangers in our own home to our own son. 3 days later, at 2 a.m., Sandra tried to break into our house with a crowbar, screaming that we'd stolen her baby. Police found her climbing through the nursery window, bloodied from broken glass, and had her involuntarily committed after witnessing her total break from reality. Her husband later brought their kids to meet their cousin. skeleton, and for 20 minutes it almost felt like an ordinary family gathering. We agreed not to press charges if she remained in treatment and stayed away until stable. Our civil suit settled 2 weeks later for $1.2 million, enough to erase our medical debt and start a college fund for James, though the city admitted no wrongdoing and sealed the record. Mills lost his pension and faced federal charges carrying up to 20 years. My husband and I entered couples therapy, working through the guilt and resentment the ordeal had planted between us. James caught up on his milestones remarkably fast. The first time he reached up from his crib and said, "Mama," I sat on the floor crying for an hour. Mills was convicted 8 months later, sentenced to 18 months federal time. Not nearly enough, but enough to bring some peace. The hospital later adopted new policy, informally called James's Law, requiring officers to defer to medical staff during emergencies and criminalizing interference with life-saving treatment. A year on, we held a small backyard birthday party. A letter arrived from Sandra's treatment facility. Just 3 words in shaky handwriting. "I'm so sorry." My husband, after our case drew public attention, was offered a new position by a tech founder who'd followed the story online, restoring our finances almost overnight. The nurse whose recording broke the case received an $80,000 whistleblower settlement and enrolled in nursing school to become a patient advocate. We testified before state legislators, whose resulting bills mandated police deference to medical staff during emergencies, recorded custody removals, and immediate judicial review of emergency separation. 2 years after it all began, I gave birth again, a daughter, Hope, in the very same hospital, this time with no handcuff, no officers, no threat, just my husband's hand in mine and nurses who remembered us celebrating alongside. James, walking and babbling by then, pointed at his sister and declared "baby" over and over, running to fetch his toys to show her. We still flinch at hard knocks on the door. My husband still checks the lock 3 times before bed. But we are, finally, just an ordinary family dealing with ordinary problems. A toddler who won't eat vegetables, a newborn keeping us up at night instead of court dates and caseworkers. James will likely never remember those first 5 months. We'll remember them for him. Every document and photograph kept carefully in a box, waiting for the day he's old enough to know exactly what his name once cost us, and exactly how hard we fought to bring him home. There are still nights I lie awake running through everything that could have gone differently. If Sandra hadn't reacted the way she did at that shower. If Mills had simply asked a single follow-up question, instead of assuming the worst the second he saw a name on a folder. If the hospital's own policy manual hadn't happened to be sitting on a tablet at exactly the right moment to slow things down just enough for surgery to happen at all. It's strange to realize how much of your child's entire future can hinge on split-second decisions made by people who will never have to live with the consequences of getting it wrong. I think about the nurse, Sarah, more than almost anyone else in this story. She lost her job for doing the one thing that ultimately saved us, quietly documenting the truth, while everyone around her was busy protecting a version of events that was convenient rather than accurate. It would have been so easy for her to stay quiet, especially once she saw what speaking up cost her professionally. Instead, she kept a recording on her phone for months, waiting for the moment it would actually matter. I don't know that I could have shown that kind of patience under that kind of pressure. I'm not sure most people could. Sandra's case still unsettles me in ways I haven't fully worked through. It would be simple to just call her a villain in this story and leave it there, but the truth is messier than that. She lost a child at 5 months, never processed it, and the grief calcified into something that eventually broke her from reality entirely. That doesn't excuse a single thing she did to us, the false report, the stolen scrubs, the crowbar through our nursery window, but it does mean the person who nearly destroyed our family was, underneath all of it, someone who never got help for her own unbearable loss. I don't know what justice looks like for a situation like that. I only know that pressing charges wouldn't have given either of us anything we actually needed. What still makes me angriest, even now, isn't really Sandra. It's every single official who had the power to slow this down and chose momentum instead. The officer who decided a false report was worth risking 2 lives over rather than asking one clarifying question. The caseworker who documented an infant's normal distress as evidence of parental failure. The prosecutor who kept pushing forward a case everyone could see was collapsing simply because revering course felt like admitting fault. Nobody in that chain set out, I think, to nearly kill me or nearly cost James's life. They just each made the easier choice for themselves at every single fork in the road. And all those easier choices added up to catastrophe for a family that had done nothing wrong beyond picking a name with meaning behind it. James is older now, chasing his sister around the living room, utterly unaware that his own name was once treated as evidence in a federal case. Someday, when he's old enough, we'll open that box in the closet and tell him everything, not to frighten him, but because I think he deserves to know exactly how hard 2 people fought to make sure he grew up in this house with these parents, instead of becoming a case file that got quietly closed and forgot. Some stories are worth remembering in full, even the parts that never should have happened in the first place. Like and subscribe for more videos like these. Thanks for watching.